Greetings, my name is Dr. Kimya Nance. I am a City Faculty Fellow, and today we're going to talk about creating effective learning outcomes. Okay, by the end of this presentation, the learner will be able to identify two benefits for creating effective learning outcomes, describe four components of an effective learning outcome, describe the relationship between student learning outcomes, assessment, and instructional activities, discuss strategies to align assessments to SLOs, and discuss strategies to align instructional activities to SLOs. So, an effective learning outcome. For an outcome to be effective, what we want to make sure is that we have clear statements of what will be learned, that those statements are succinct and they describe the essential learning to be achieved, and that we are able to identify how that learning will be demonstrated. So creating effective learning outcomes, there's many benefits. Here's some that are listed as relates to our students. One, it fosters student-centered learning. For a long time in education, a lot of the curricula were developed based on what the teacher would do. But by putting that student at the center of that objective, it's going to move towards, and if we follow through with that, we're going to move towards student-centered learning. It provides a clear idea to the students what they're going to learn and what they need to know. Highlights what they need to know for that particular course, and then it just doesn't waste time. Unclear objectives, you don't know what's going on. What do you need to learn? You need to clarify. So it maximizes the learner's time, and it also fosters active learning. And there are benefits to us as faculty. So as faculty, if we have an effective learning outcome, then it's going to help us guide our lesson planning, our module development. It's going to give us guidance on what and how much to teach and plan accordingly. It's going to make it easier when we're trying to align our instructional materials to those objectives, and then foster the selection of appropriate learning activities. As it relates to assessment, if you have a clear, effective learning outcome, then the process of selecting appropriate assessment strategies and mapping those assessments to the outcome is going to be easier. With having effective learning outcomes, it's going to be easier to make those midway assessments and help you tweak if you need to. It provides, again, students with a clear guide for study. It facilitates measuring the effectiveness of the learning unit. Then there are accreditation benefits. It's easier to determine for accreditors if the mission and goals of the institution, if your course outcomes have been aligned to the mission and goals of the institution. It helps determine processes used for student learning, and it facilitates accreditation agencies in determining whether the desired objectives are met. So what makes a learning objective effective? One, it's going to focus on the learner. It needs to be topic relevant. And then we need it to be smart, a specific, include a measurable verb, and is attainable within a realistic time frame. So focusing on the learner. We need to determine our audience, okay? Who is our learner? It's real important. And that's something that's real basic, okay? If you're in the classroom, it's your students. But it's not just who the students, that they're students in your class, but actually what level of student are they? So these are things that we just need to call situation factors that we need to consider when we're developing these outcomes. So is this course a lower division course, an upper division course? Is it graduate level? What's the nature of the subject? The type of objectives that we develop are really influenced by the nature of the subject. So what one may do in an art class and what you're looking for in a music class may be different what you are looking to occur in a science class or a nursing course. Topic relevant. I laugh at this one because I always think about when I'm in church and you have maybe a visitor minister or somebody coming, and they say what the topic is, but what they talk about has nothing to do with the topic. But what makes the learning outcome effective is that it's topic relevant. So if the class is a science course, as someone mentioned that they were in science, and the objective has something to do with a nursing outcome, it's not necessarily linked. So we want to make sure that it's topic relevant. So whatever that topic is, if the course is a composition course, then you're thinking that those objectives are going to relate to composition. So we want it to link tightly to the topic it's associated with, support the course description, and be congruent with the level and goals of the course. Then we want to use measurable verbs. And I pulled this example from this link here. So when I send you the PowerPoint slide, you can pull this here. But learning outcomes should guide the selection of assessments. Therefore, they need to be measurable, not vague. There are lots of vague outcomes. Obtaining a working knowledge, gaining appreciation. It's really hard to determine if those are measurable. And so it's good to think of the question, what would the learner do differently if they understood or appreciated X? Okay, so that makes it more effective. And we've heard of Bloom's taxonomy, and this has been mentioned, is what most of us follow. And so we have a various level of cognition from the knowledge all the way to the synthesis and evaluation phase. And then these are some action verbs that are associated with Bloom's. Then I wanted to spend a little bit time talking about the Fink's taxonomy of significant learning. Why not used as much, but it really does have some really cool aspects to it as it relates to learning that might not necessarily come through utilizing Bloom's. So when we look at foundation, and then where Bloom's does a hierarchy, what Fink's does is says that you can have different hierarchies within each area, but that they all come together. Okay, so you have the foundational knowledge, and that relates to understanding and remembering information, application, developing critical, creative, and practical thinking skills. Integration is making connection between information, ideas, perspectives, people, life. And then those three, the foundational, the application, and the integration, those really correlate well with Bloom's. Then you, very easily, I would say, then you get to the part that sometimes we don't spend as much time measuring, is that human dimension, and that's learning about oneself or learning about others. Caring, and that stuck out to me as a nurse, that actually in one of our essentials for baccalaureate education now that we are going to have to show that, demonstrate that our students are able to demonstrate caring. And so how do you do that? And so that's developing new feelings, interests, or values. Learning how to learn is becoming a better student, being more inquisitive about their own learning, and being self-directed. So those are different components. But Fink's taxonomy of significant learning, I think is something that also can be helpful to us. So when we look at the measurable verbs that using Fink, we have several listed here. Foundational knowledge, and again with Fink, within each learning area of learning, you have is different levels. So it's not a hierarchy model, again, like it is with the Bloom's taxonomy. And then our human dimensions, caring and learning to learn. These are some associated measurable verbs that you can use. And again, you've seen these, but it's just in another model if you haven't seen this model before. So what we just talked about was measurable verbs. And what I did was I shared with you Bloom's taxonomy as well as Fink's taxonomy, because within those, you can find verbs that can be utilized in your effective learning outcome. So we talked about measurable and now attainable. Can this actually be reached? Okay, if this is an English 101 class, is the student going to be able to develop a research proposal if it's their first class there? Maybe not. It may be very hard. If there's a class, if this is a class of 100, are they going to be able to obtain very detailed goals? Maybe not. So we want to make sure that those goals are attainable within the framework and those situational factors that impact a learning. Is it realistic? And then do we have a time frame? When do we want this done? We do know that students learn at different rates, but at what point do we expect learning to occur? And so we want to make sure that that is measurable so we can go back and reassess. So we talked about effective outcomes, and for this presentation, the primary focus is student learning outcomes. So student learning outcomes describe the knowledge, skills, abilities, and attitudes that faculty want a student to be able to demonstrate at the end or as a result of the educational experience. So this is a neat little tool I found on the internet. And when I send this to you, I'll give you the link. Okay, so I said, oh, this is nice because we're going to practice doing some things and maybe the colors will stick out to you. So this is a basic tool that you can use to develop your learning outcome. So by the end of, and that would be the time frame, end of the unit, end of the lesson, end of the course, the students will be able to, student or the term learner, be able to, whatever that action verb is. And that action verb is what we talked about either under Bloom's or Fink's. And that they will be able to, with the action verb, do an observable knowledge, skill, or attitude. So here's an example, and this is from a history course. By the end of the unit, so we have our blue, that's our time frame, the student will be able, that's student-centered, to summarize, that's our action, the key forces affecting the rise of China as an economic power in the global market. So now we need to determine, and this is where you get to have fun, is if these outcomes here are effective or ineffective. So if someone could read this outcome for us, and then we can just talk about if we believe this is an effective outcome or an ineffective outcome. Okay, I'll read it. By the end of the practicum experience, the student will create a lesson plan for a 60-minute hands-on science lesson for 7th grade students. Do you think that's an effective or an ineffective outcome based on what we talked about, student learning outcome?
Well, it has a time frame.
Okay, so it has a time frame.
That's one of the.
That is great. Anybody else? Any other pieces you see? Do we need to go back a slide and look again at the pieces? So we have time frame, student, so it's the learner centered, the action verb, and something that's observable. Okay.
Right. And I'm sorry, I would have read it earlier, but I couldn't get my finger on the speaker button here.
That's okay.
So I was trying to think about the 4 things. So it has the time frame, it has the student will, it has the action verb create, and then it has something specific they're going to create. So I think it depends. If I'm looking at it as a course, well, maybe it's because it's not my field, but I'm thinking this is a very specific learning outcome. It's not broad.
Okay, well, let's.
And I guess in terms of a class, I'm thinking, and maybe this because this is a practical experience. But I think in terms of the classes I teach, that might be, you know, a specific assignment with that outcome. I don't see it as a learning outcome for my whole course, but maybe for a practicum it would be.
And as we're looking at these learning outcomes, we're actually looking at them at the course level. So within the course, you can have that course objective, you can have an objective for the unit of study, you can have an objective for your assignment. So it just really depends on where you are placing that learning outcome for the student. So let's look at this one. This is effective. As you both mentioned, we did have a time frame. It was student-centered. We did have an action verb, and we had exactly what they were going to be able to do. So at the end of that practicum experience, they're going to be able to create this lesson plan for the 60-minute hands-on science lesson for 7th grade students. And that's something that you could actually go back and measure. Okay, let's try
Okay,
another.
I have one comment, okay?
Oh.
My comment is this, okay? So as you say, must be relevant, right? So then determine this course is a science course or not, because based on the learning outcome, so 6 minutes hand-on science lesson, okay? The meaning is the relative and relative is this is a science course. Make sure this is a science course. So then if this is a science course, so the learning outcome talk about the science. And like David said, it's too narrow or too broad because you in the learning outcome, it did not address what kind of science. They just say 6 minutes hand-on science. What kind of science? So maybe put a specific what kind of science more relevant.
Like earth science or life science. Yes, that could make that better.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yes. So in this framework, this was actually coming from an educational program where they were creating, actions for the student. But right, to be more specific, we would want to say the type of science. Thank you so much, Dr. Zhang.
Actually, this is Mary Wilkerson.
Yeah.
I actually find it to actually be okay because of the components of this lesson. This actually incorporates many skills that the student has to learn during the course. There are many things that they have to learn how to do in order to create that lesson plan. And it may not be life science or whatever, because they don't necessarily know what courses the students may be teaching, so they wouldn't need to make it very specific, because you could have students who might be teaching a life science course, they might be teaching biology, they might be teaching chemistry or whatever for that student in 7th grade. But there's kind of an indication that if it's 7th grade, there's a particular curriculum that the students will be getting during 7th grade, and so they kind of tailor it onto that. So I actually think that this encompasses a lot in the student being able to develop a lesson plan at the end of their practicum.
And what is wonderful about, thank you, Dr. Wilkerson, and Dr. Zhang, what is wonderful about these objectives is that there is always room where we could continue to improve depending on the situation. So Dr. Zhang, from your perspective, not really knowing the situation and having all the foundation, we're just really putting objectives out there, can give you a better context of what's going on. And as Dr. Wilkerson mentioned, having this broad base can actually, when you talk about create, that's a higher level of cognition for the students when they're demonstrating this, it will be able to reach those outcomes as well.
Yeah, if this is a science education course, that'd be right. If the topic is relevant to, let's say, 7th grade, maybe middle school, right?
Right.
If this is a course is associated with the middle school science education, the learning outcome is very precise. I agree with that, but if it's not for science education, maybe I don't know, but I don't know the course background. But anyway.
It's okay, but if we were to develop an assessment and we're going to talk about that a little bit, we would be able to determine if they had a hands-on science lesson for whatever science it may be for those 7th grade students.
Okay.
Okay. So we would be able to do that and be more specific, even in our assessment. So this is the next one. Is this one effective or ineffective? During this class session, the faculty would demonstrate a lesson in robotics for students. What are your thoughts?
That's not effective. That's not what we're learning about.
Okay.
Anybody else have any thoughts?
Yeah, this is another for learning outcome. It's like in the syllabus, what the faculty members needed to do. This is like a faculty activities. It's not a learning outcome for students.
Okay.
Right?
Okay, so that's correct. That's ineffective. So we have the time frame, right? We have the action, And we have what can be measured, but we're missing who? What you guys just
Yeah.
mentioned, the student. So that one's not effective at all. Okay, here's the next one. By the end of the module, learners will self-assess their personality types using the Myers-Briggs inventory. What are your thoughts?
So it's got a time frame, it's got the learner, and then it's got what they're expected to do by the end of the module.
Okay, any other thoughts?
Yeah, I think this one should be okay. Should like outcomes. Okay.
Okay.
So I'm going to chime in, and I admit this is based on my own ignorance. One of our characteristics was they need to be measurable verbs, and I'm thinking, how do I measure self-assessment?
Yes, you can measure self-assessment with their self-assessment by completing this actual activity. So self-assessment can be demonstrated in surveys and reflections. It can be demonstrated by a particular activity which they're doing. So you can actually measure their self-assessment. They have to report it, but you can determine what that is, but that is an action. And then when we think about that, is that not what reflection is? Where we have our students complete activities, we have them go back and look at, what did I learn about this? What could I have done better? That's, you can say reflecting, but this aspect is actually completing an assessment, but it is self-assessment, reflection. Those are activities that students are looking within, analyzing what has taken place, and it coming up with maybe a new thought pattern of learning or a revised way of thinking. So this one is effective. By the end of the module, we have a time frame. I use the term learners because that's used very frequently. We'll self-assess. So self-assess is the action, and they're doing that by they're self-assessing their personality types by using the Myers-Briggs inventory, and that's very easy to see if they've completed that, if you needed to look at it. Okay, so revising learning outcomes for effectiveness. So we've practiced a little bit, so let's practice a little bit more. So remember this quick little model. There's many, but this was a quick one. By the end of our time frame, students will be able to an action verb, an observable knowledge, skill, or attitude. Does anybody want to pick one of these to work through? Doesn't matter, anyone. Okay, well, no takers. Anybody in the chat? Let me see. Okay, well, that's okay because we got it revised just for you. Okay, so the first one was to employ basic lab skills. So to improve this objective, we added our time frame, we added our learner, which was the student, and then we became a little bit more specific in employing basic lab skills and techniques to handle microorganisms in a lab setting. As it relates to the students will learn the causes of World War II, we added a time frame by the end of the unit. We already had students will, and then we became more specific in speaking that they would be able to describe, and what are they going to be able to describe, which becomes more specific, is the major economic and social ramifications of World War II. So that narrows that down for us. And then the last one, students will be able to create a plan for responding to misbehavior. We added our time frame by the end of the unit. Then we have our individual students or the learner. They'll be able to create, which is the same, but we became a little bit more specific with our plan. Create a plan for responding to misbehavior associated with attention getting, power, revenge, and inadequacy. Any comments about these?
I like the tool. I think it makes it it's really helpful. Makes it simple for faculty to plug in what they need to plug in.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so learning outcomes assessments and teaching and learning activities. I've obtained this image from this link right here. You'll have access to it when it's sent to you. But as we move to the next part, so we've talked about the basic components of an effective learning outcome. And we talked about what makes an outcome effective. And we worked through a simple 4-step model to create our outcomes. Now what we're going to move towards is looking at assessment and teaching and learning activities or instructional activities. And before we move forward, you see this nice little triangle here, and you see the arrows going both ways. Essentially, this is to say that all of these things are interactive, so that your assessments need to relate to the outcome, and your teaching activities need to relate to this stated or intended learning outcome. And they also need to relate to each other. How many times do we say, or have we said, that we want a student to be able to critically analyze something, and then we have an assessment for them, but the teaching and learning strategies never presented them with the opportunity to critically analyze? And so we want to make sure when we're doing these, and we're going to go through this, is that not only are these items aligning to the outcomes, they're also aligning to each other. So as it relates to assessment, if you notice, I went from the learning outcome right to the assessment. And that is because your learning outcome is what you want your the learner to be able to demonstrate, or the knowledge and skills at the end. And so what assessment is an appraisal of that knowledge, skill, attitudes, and beliefs that students have acquired. The actions by the faculty and students in this assessment process can be used to document learning. Assessment should be defined by student learning outcomes and demonstrated through review and evaluation of student work. So when we're talking about these assessments, we need to determine the acceptable level of evidence for the desired results of learning. So if our objective for our student is that they need to be able to demonstrate, and I'll use from my discipline, demonstrate the appropriate techniques of IV insertion, then I need to, when I'm looking for assessment, need to determine how am I going to measure, and how am I going to determine what that level of measurement is for what is acceptable to assess that the student is able to effectively demonstrate. Now, in our discipline, we have like lab tools, and we have steps within the lab tools that the students utilize, and they're evaluated off of each step, and they have to have so much of the percentage of that is satisfactory, that they have successfully completed each step. And then we have identified what are critical competencies, and if they don't meet those, then they have not successfully met that outcome. But this is very important. And remember, when we're talking about the course level outcomes, it can be the course as it relates for the whole course. It can be an aspect of the course, a unit of study, or it might be a particular lesson, or it might be an outcome as it relates to a particular assignment. But the bottom line is, once that outcome is determined, you really need to know how you're going to assess it, because if you don't assess, you're not going to know if it's met or not. And if your assessment doesn't appropriately relate or align, as I showed you in the triangle, to the outcome, then you're not really measuring what your outcome is. You really have no idea if you're meeting it or not. The other thing we need to do as we're thinking about aligning our assessments to the student learning outcomes is consider the domains of learning. And we spent quite a bit of time talking about the cognitive domain in the first part of the presentation as it relates to Bloom's and Fink's, and you'll have those taxonomies. And we're very familiar with that. And Bloom's also goes into the psychomotor domain, as well as the affective domain. The psychomotor domain includes the physical skill, coordination, manipulation that can be assessed through performances and projects, for example. We have the affective domain, and that's our emotions, attitudes, and preferences. And then we have the cognitive domain. And I put this in here because you know what, if the way that we are moving, this one is as it relates to the person's will or volition to actually do something, to self-regulate. It incorporates things such as a leadership. And you can assess this through reflection, survey, attendance, if there's civil, timeliness, and originality of work. And as I'm thinking of a lot of the disciplines, and I think of the strategic plan we just completed and what they say that we want our students to be able to do, some of these things that make you job ready outside of your knowledge and the psychomotor and your attitude is really right in here. You know, being a good citizen, being self-motivated, those things that move you forward are actually measured in that domain. And then the other domain I wanted to mention is the social domain. And the social domain relates to the social cultural processes that accompany thinking, feeling, and sensing movement. So when we think about, in addition to thinking about the domain of learning as it relates to our assessments, we want to think about, how we're going to incorporate formative and summative assessments. And this table right here just gives a brief overview of formative and summative assessment. The formative purpose being to improve teaching and learning and understand where students are, and then the summative is to evaluate the learning. Both can be formal and informal, but in this table that has a formative is informal and a summative is usually formal. And it just depends. You have with the formative is ongoing. So when we're trying to get a student to a higher order of thinking or being able to critically think, they need to have little ways to measure their ability or what they've learned. And we need to know along the way, instead of just like waiting to the end, did they get it? So it's really good to have these assessments and to plan for those. Let me go back. Here we go. Usually the formative assessments are low stake and the summative are high stakes. And then here are some examples. And these, the way that you utilize these assessments really determines where it's sitting. So truly both of these could go, observations can go in both ways depending on what you're looking at. But for formative observations, homework, question and answer sessions, self-evals, reflection on performances, and curriculum-based measures. As it relates to summative assessments, projects or comprehensive projects, group projects, performance assessments, portfolios, papers, in-class examinations, and then state, national, or tests, as well as certifications. This tool right here, or this model, is something that you can use to align your assessments to student learning outcomes. So the ALOA model, Aligning Learning Outcomes and Assessment, highlights the connection between the attended learning outcomes and assessment strategies used during a course. It's a tool that can be used to link learning outcomes and assessment tasks. And I call this the helping you get started. Now, what's right here available for you right now is the e-version of this tool that you'll receive the link. And it's really neat. You can just go in and put in your outcome and it'll actually give you some recommendations on the type of assessments that may align to the action verbs determined by that. So this tool that's on the web, I know right now a lot of us are, well, most of us are doing some type of hybrid learning. This tool is dedicated here for e-learning activities that you might want to use to enhance your hybrid online course as relates to assessments that you can use along the way. So when you get that, take a look at those that you can use in your class in Canvas shell. And those things can be a part of the formative assessments that you're doing with your students that they can actually work on their own and get a feedback on. The other tool, excuse me, like I'm going backwards here, okay. Here it is. Here we go. Okay, the learning goals, outcomes. This little thing's in the way. Here it is. Let me go back. I'm sorry. It's like I have this thing up here and I'm trying to move it. It's in the way. Here it is. Okay, the learning goals inventory. This is another tool that you can use to align your assessments to student learning outcomes. We talked about the Fink's taxonomy earlier, and so this actually goes right with that. And so when you receive this PowerPoint, you can have a document version of the inventory where you can plug in your learning outcomes, as well as the online tool that you can actually just type in and work through the inventory and receive some type of feedback. And so these are just some items to get you started. And of course, you can always schedule a time with Citi to talk about your outcomes with your course and your assessments and how those are aligning. Then this one is, and I love it, I know it's busy, right? But it takes the Bloom's taxonomy, and then it pulls it out to what you're saying your action verbs are right here. I hope you see my arrow as I'm moving it here. But the action verbs is the next outer part, and then different types of assessments that you can do as it relates to those actions. So it gives you some ideas. And I pulled this from an article by Crawford that was published in 2012. So the first one, and I want us to just practice real quick, is the action describe. So we have an outcome that has describe, and I know it's a lot here, so let me see if I can get us in the right area. Okay, so we're in the green. Okay, so the action is described as a knowledge level. So what type of assessments could we use to determine if an individual is able to describe? And that's the outer ring.
Ask that one more time.
So the action that we have is describe, right? The action verb is describe. And so we're not saying what we're describing, we're not going into detail like it, but we're going to describe something. So we already know we're going to have a time frame that the learner they're going to describe, they're going to be able to describe something. And so this outer ring here, it helps us evaluate if they're able to describe. So for example, in this situation, you could use a multiple choice test. You can have a scavenger hunt. You could have them present a presentation where they're describing some type of topic, and you can have them provide specific examples in order to describe. Okay, do you have questions about this wheel? I call it the Bloom's wheel.
I was just going to say
because what it's doing is it's got the nomenclature in the middle, and then it's got the words, but then it's got activities or things you can do
right
outside. So up there at describe, it says short story or speech or analogies, comparing. That's good.
You can do that. And on the outer one is those evaluations that can happen as well. Okay.
So I was just going to say, I'm sorry. I know this is a really busy graphic already, but I'm seeing things like, short answer test and poster presentation in knowledge. And I'm just thinking, some of these things you could use short answer tests and poster presentations to, measure students' analysis, their synthesis. It depends on the questions that are asked. What kind of a presentation is it? What are they expected to do?
Correct.
And so I hate them to put everything in every category, right? That would be hard.
But you could, depending on where they are, and I think that goes back to what we talked about, the situation, the level of the student. So this is something to help you get started, but it doesn't remove the critical thinking of what you're asking them to do. So if I'm asking someone to just make a poster about baking a cake, that's one thing, one level. If I'm asking them to present a poster and research that they completed, that's a whole nother level.
I want them to actually bake the cake and bring it to me to test.
We've done that in we actually done that in our communication course. There was a parfait or something the students made and they had to bring it in. Okay, so this wheel is, what it does, it just gives you some type of thoughts to think about as it relates to your action verbs or what you are can actually do. Okay, so the next one is evaluate. And so our evaluation is here in red, okay? And so if we were to think of some way to assess or that evaluation had taken place, some examples here are case studies, critiques, simulations, appraisals. Can you think of some others or how you would want to determine if a person was able to evaluate?
Well, a survey. I mean, did you say survey?
No, this depends on what the survey's saying, right? You can utilize a survey to evaluate. I think a lot of times what we try to reach for in many of our courses that are undergraduate is getting them somewhere to this application and comprehension level as it relates to the students. And at some time on a higher order evaluation depends on what you're teaching and the level of the students. You can actually utilize them all, but I know a lot of times we're working to see, you know, do they understand? Can they apply this information? But this wheel is a tool. It's a busy wheel, but it does give you some recommendation if you just had no idea. And here's, you know, you have your little action verbs here. You want to contrast something. And to the point that you mentioned, Dr. Comp, you know, you'll see some of the same activities in different areas. Okay, so the same activity with the case studies, that was listed with evaluations, with analysis. It just depends on the context of that learning outcome. Okay, so when we look at aligning our instructional strategies to learning outcomes, I wanted to go back to the triangle that I showed you right before I talked about assessment. Now, the reason we went to assessment first is why? Why do we want, once we have our outcome, why do we need to clearly know how we're going to assess that outcome? Why is that important?
I always go back to, and I think this is one of the hardest things I think I do as a professor, quite frankly. But you know, as a trained scientist, you know, as we go into the research lab, you know, and you have a hypothesis and you figure out how you're going to test it. Well, you have to have measurement tools that will actually test what you're going to say that they're going to test, right? It's no different in the classroom. We have to be able to assess, and in the way that we assess, we're truly assessing, did they meet that outcome or not? But there's not always a clear way to do that. We're kind of learning that as we go to some degree. You know, it's kind of our own experiment. So if you have any great insights, I'd love to hear them.
Yes, and I think, you know, as education has moved along and moved forward, most of us have not been educated, including myself, in, you know, creating outcomes and evaluation methods and this whole intention of alignment and how, you know, I have what I want them to do and I'm teaching and I think I'm doing a great job teaching, but me providing a lecture every week is not going to yield my students to critically think because they're listening to me. And so now when we're talking about our instructional strategies and how they're now our map for our students, once we have what the assessment is, we really know what we want them to do, then guess what we can do? We can now take our teaching strategies, and this takes time, and they have experts and people with degrees in this, takes time to build and develop teaching and learning activities that will yield us to what we want the outcome to be. So we have our outcome, we have how they're going to be assessed, that's going to measure that. If we get that aligned, and you know, you go and talk about rubrics and things like that, you know, this could go on and on. But on a very top level, speaking of this, knowing those assessments and having those assessment linked to the outcome is really important. And what I'm discussing and talking to you really is a component of doing backwards design. I'm just not mentioning it until now. But we have our outcomes. We go right to how we know that has occurred. And then our teaching and learning activities or instructional activities is like the roadmap to get there. So, but they all enter or relate. So what I have for you guys is, first we have to give our definition: instructional strategies, teaching and learning activities that best guide students towards the desired level of competence acquisition, i.e. learning outcomes. So I have another little tool that are some teaching strategies that can go along with the Bloom's taxonomy. And I really focus mostly on Bloom's as it relates to this, on how we can connect that action to our instructional activities. But remember, with the content and the way that we develop those instruction activities need to lead the student to how we're going to evaluate them. So if we're evaluating them on critical thinking and we don't have any type of learning activities or instructional activities for our students that are going to promote critical thinking, are we going to get them to that designation? Or are we going to say, oh, our students can't think? Have we provided the activities for them to develop over time as it relates to other critical thinking, as it relates to other outcomes that we want for our students? So here's one, and let's discuss this one. So aligning instructional strategies to learning outcome verbs. So here's some options. So by the end of the unit, the learner will be able to create, this is the one we discussed not too long ago, create a plan for responding to misbehavior associated with getting, power, revenge, and inadequacy. So our action verb is create. And so what are some type of learning activities, we're going to have them create a plan. What are some learning activities that are going to help our student get to creating, to be able to create a plan? What would we need to do?
For that particular objective?
Mm-hmm. And don't get to the specific, just creating a plan. To have a plan, what do you need to know?
Well, they would have to do some writing. They might have to present, or they could do some kind of visual. I mean, if we're talking about what they're going to do.
Right. And for what we're talking about now is some learning activities we could provide for the student, either in our modules or through our instruction, that's going to move them towards actually creating that plan, or to create. So what are some?
Well, the student could observe some examples of lesson plans. Mm-hmm. There are certainly lots of those around. So they could observe some lesson plans. They could actually do some research, and probably perhaps with some group work with other students, and well, one activity, I'm just thinking of one activity that could be done. If they have a lesson plan, they could also watch that's been created by somebody. Mm-hmm. And perhaps they have a video of the teacher teaching the lesson. They could actually look at both of them and see how it kind of works together. It's something to see it on paper. It's another thing to see it in action.
Okay, so look at examples of someone creating that lesson plan, and be able to talk about the different components of that, even being able to identify the components of a lesson plan, and actually practice those. So could have case studies that could help them in actually practicing and developing before we actually get to the part of evaluating that. Okay. Here's another one. So we were talking about the World War II. And so by the end of the unit, students will be able to describe the major economic and social ramifications of World War II. So our action verb here is describe. And so what type of instructional strategies could we use that's going to yield our students to be able to describe?
They could present.
Okay. And that actually would bring them to a higher level if they're able to present that knowledge and teach that knowledge. Okay, so definitely if they can do that, they can describe. What else could they do to describe?
I'm thinking of my daughter who's majoring in international relations, and I have reviewed so many essays for her. But this sounds exactly like the topic of an essay that she would be writing.
Okay.
And so written assignments, like an
Right.
essay.
Right, great. So those are some examples. And if you see right here in our list right here, to assist us, we have describe, and then we have some ways that you can determine that you can foster in your teaching and learning activities. And so as relates to the student being able to describe, then you could put into your lesson opportunities for them to discuss topics, just like how we're doing today. We're discussing things, and when students are actively engaged, they tend to remember more. And then when they actually do, as what you mentioned, Dr. DeSille, and actually implement something, it really sticks. That's a high impact practice when you have students teaching and providing information. But for the describe, yes, just they could do a writing assignment. I mean, we could facilitate that. We could talk to them about how they do that. And it looks like we have something in the chat, so let me take a look and see. Okay, someone said provide opportunities for students to use research and present it in an Adobe Spark presentation, PowerPoint, visual poster. Students create a historical documentary. Thank you, Dr. White.
And that's what we do in adult too. They have a group project that they do where they present information about the disease processes they've learned about through the course of the semester.
Okay.
And how nurses, provide care for those clients. And then they look at evidence-based research as well and talk about what the latest research is saying in reference to that particular client population.
Okay. Thank you for sharing that, Dr. DeSille. Okay, here's another one we had earlier. By the end of this course, students will be able to employ basic lab skills and techniques to safely handle microorganisms in a lab setting. Sounds like they're doing something, right? So how would we foster, how would we foster our that achievement of that through our instructional strategies, either through how we have our learning activities within the course or teaching activities? What would we do to help them? I know practice, right?
Yeah, well, I think even before you practice, and I'm not an expert in microbiology, by the way, right? But I've seen 1,000 students now that have taken it and gone through that. But I found that it often really helps if they observe somebody else doing it correctly. At least in my lab as I've worked with students, and then I turn around and I can watch them, right? And they learn how to do it, and I'm watching them and to help them to correct any errors. And then I turn them on their own, but I'm still keeping an eye from the corner, right? Because we're talking about, safely handling microorganisms here, right?
Right.
So you're not 100% going to turn them loose, but then you have some kind of a practical experience where they have to walk through and demonstrate that they've done this, and they can produce a product at the end, whether it's, in this case, microorganisms, maybe they're testing to see, what kind of a bacteria it is or isn't. And they show the whole time that we've handled them safely and I can do this.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
So
I think that there's a one word you added on that is the independent. Students will be able to apply basic life skills and technicals to safely handle that independently. Because somehow many cases under supervising from the faculty member. And if even you find a job, for example, lab technician, somehow from very beginning, so you should provide the skill leadership supervising. So if added independently or just under the supervising, safely handle the more complete sentence. Because this is very, very tricky over there.
right, because you can handle something and not be safe. So even if you had like a lecture and discussion about safety protocols, that's going to still help move them towards what they will need to do for this objective. So there are a lot of things that can build us to them actually demonstrating that or the term we use here, and employ these skills, but we have to build towards that. So recommendations that you talked about was demonstration. They can watch that. Either the faculty can demonstrate themselves as the instructional activity, or if you can have a video of the correct way of doing that, as well as just reviewing the steps and understanding what those steps are. You might have to test the students on understanding appropriate steps for the skills, as well as the safety aspect. So those are all really good suggestions. And these are just, I made sure I didn't pick anything in my discipline so that we can make sure we represent different ones. But these are all just a way to just get started as it relates to effective learning outcomes and that alignment as it relates to our learning activities and our assessments. And again, we're going to start with our learning outcome, and we have 4 parts to that learning outcome. Do you guys remember the parts that we talked about with our little basic model to get us started? Can somebody type in what was one aspect of the model? Oh, you're muted, Dr. DeSale.
Oh, you want us to write on that?
No, you don't have to write it. You just say it. So we had that little model.
Student. We have to have the student.
Okay, so one aspect of the model is that it had the student was there. What was another aspect of our outcome model?
Measurable verbs.
Okay, we talked about measurable verbs, and remember we talked about Bloom's as well as Sphinx taxonomy. Okay, so what else was there? Right, it was in blue. It was the first thing in blue.
Time frame?
Yes, time frame. And then the last part that was in green was what? It was the actions and activities, correct? I'm trying to make sure we meet our outcomes for this presentation. Okay, so summary and takeaway is that creating effective learning outcomes will facilitate the development of appropriate assessment and instructional activities. And we talked about outcomes, assessment, and instructional activities, and how do those relate to one another? We had a triangle. How do they relate?
One of them had to do with evaluations. I don't know. That's part of the triangle though, isn't it?
Yeah, so we have effective, so the relationship, and we talk about our learning outcomes and assessment and instructional activity. We said there was a relationship between these. And what's that relationship between our learning outcome and our assessment and our instructional activities?
They are aligned.
Okay, that they need to be aligned to each other, right? So look, guess what we're going to do before I go back? Because we're going to make sure we get our outcomes together. We are going to go back to this beautiful triangle here. And I want you to remember this, that your instructional activities or your teaching and learning activities need to relate to your outcomes, right? Your assessments need to relate to your outcomes. They need to align. Let me go back. And guess what? What we talked about, your teaching and learning activities need to do what? They need to lead to that assessment. They need to align. So in our triangle, everything needs to align together. What we did today is we started with our learning outcomes, and then we went right to how you're going to assess the effectiveness. And then your teaching and learning activities or your instructional activities is what's going to lead the students to being successful on that, meeting those outcomes as well as completing that assessment. But if you start with the outcome, get the assessment that's going to measure the outcome and get that together, then it's going to really make it easier for you to design your lesson plan and learning activities and focus the students to move them along where they need to be. So our relationship is that they are all related together. You can't pull one out and just have an assessment with the outcome and that measures, and you're not giving them a roadmap, which a lot of times it happens. Sometimes we have a great assessment for the outcome, but we never did do the appropriate teaching and learning activities to get the students to get to that area. So now we're going to go back and just for a refresher so we can look at our colors again. Let me see where we are. This is where we have our colors by the end of. So we have our time frame, then we have our students will be able to, the action verb, and then observable knowledge, skill, or attitude. So now we're going to go back to our summary, and you'll have this to look at. and critique to see. So creating effective learning outcomes will facilitate the development of appropriate assessments and instructional activities. Our little triangle, everything relates. There are benefits for students, faculty, and programs when outcomes are designed and aligned well with assessment and instructional activities. And we talked about some of those benefits where students know what to learn. They can focus their time. Faculty can help better develop their lesson plans. Programs can really say, hey, we are actually measuring what we say. We're actually, here's the evidence that we are doing what we're saying we're doing. And that helps as well as accreditation. We talked about that. And then we have some tools that are available to assist with alignment. I gave you, I think it was 2 tools that we talked about as relates to assessment that you'll be able to click on the links so you can look and plug in your objectives in there. And so we talked about those. And then if you need help, this is just a little overview from a novice, right? But if you need help, you definitely can reach out to City that can help you with your learning objectives, as well as what I've talked about, not formally, but the backwards design and as it relates to your learning outcomes, okay? So these are the references and you'll have those. And just let me know, do you have any questions or any comments you want to add? I've enjoyed talking to you and I've enjoyed your level of participation.
I really enjoyed this. This was great. Thanks. I misspelled most.
That's okay. That's okay. No judgment here. We're happy to just talk about these things and continue to grow as we interact and dialogue with one another. We continue to learn from each other. So I appreciate each of you coming today. Thank you. And if you have any additional questions or comments, feel free to email me. I will be sending a link out to you so that you can complete a survey. So thank you very much, and you have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.